Let's talk about Ruth. Woo! Okay, so before we do so, I think it's really important that we begin with a thought for the day. Or if you're watching these consecutively, then a thought for this 30 minutes. So this is from Bill Nye the Science Guy. Any fans out there? Bill Nye? Yeah? I know. Some of you, yep, right? I know, that was a funny episode. Anyway, so Bill Nye says, everyone you ever meet knows something you don't. Which I think is so profound, right? Which essentially means that we can learn something new from every single person that we encounter. I'm going to say that again. Everyone you meet knows something you don't. What if we approached relationships like that? Huh? Right? Instead of looking at someone and thinking, oh, they're different, or they look weird, or my professor is strange, and okay, I'm going to stop you. I'll get distracted. What if you looked at them and thought they have something that I could learn? Would they have some knowledge that I don't have and I could gain that from them? That is a mind-blowing. Thank you, Bill Nye. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so I want you to think right now, right, as sometimes I get you guys to reflect. Think of a time when you felt like you learned something from someone that you weren't expecting. Maybe you can reflect on that later, because I don't think that taking long pauses on video has the same effect as it does in class also. Or you can actually pause the video and then you can write about it. Pause now. Okay, now, pretend that we also had a time for reflection and sharing and all that we do. All right, so let's talk about Ruth. How about it? Interesting story, right? Very short in comparison to Joe, right? It's only 4 chapters. What I want to do is I want to go over the world inside, right? As always, talk about what's actually happening in the story. And I want to do that through a drawing. Here's my little drawing. Yee. Okay, so who do we have inside the text, right? We're in Moab. We're starting in Moab, and we have Naomi, and then we have her husband, Elimelech, and she has 2 sons, Chilon and Malon. Interestingly, their names, they actually sound like the words for diseased and perishing. So if we think about this, then allegorically, the author is telling us a story again that is sort of a metaphor, right? It's got a figurative meaning. So the sons marry Ruth and Orpah, not Oprah, right? Some students get that mixed up, but that is an R before a P, so this is Orpah, not Oprah. Although Oprah's awesome, in case you're watching Oprah. Just kidding. Okay. Sorry. A little silly here. Okay, that's the way I am, you know that. Those of you who are familiar, my students. Okay, so here's Naomi, here are all the men and the 2 daughters that married her sons. Okay, so we find out they all die. All the men die, right? And that, well, I won't X them out. You know they die. So then what happens is these 2 young women, right, have the opportunity to go back to their people, and one does. Orpah does, right? But Ruth decides to go with Naomi, right? And this is where we have, and this is what this Walt Hall's argument, right, that we have the marriage formula, which we'll discuss obviously in the next video, but it specifically says that Ruth clung to her, right? This language is the same language that's used in the passage about Adam and Eve, about cleaving to your spouse. So we see that Ruth then says to her, do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I'll be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and even more as well, if even death parts me from you. So they end up going to Bethlehem together, and they find Boaz, who ends up being, right, the nearest kinsman, and so he ends up being the kinsman redeemer because he needs to marry Ruth, right? Remember, women at this time, their value was only in who their husband was and if they had children. So it was really important that these women had a man to be connected to and to take care of them. So ultimately in the story then we find Boaz and Ruth getting married, having a child, and then Ruth and Naomi then are cared for the duration of their lives. Often people read this story as being a story about love and romance, right? As we see from the essays for today, there may be some other ways to possibly read this. Stay tuned. What I want us to think about before we move on and look at the Brenner and Walthall essays is this way of thinking about interpretation, right? That there are 5 different sort of hermeneutical angles that we can take as we are reading the Bible. And not just the Bible, but as we're thinking about any text. But we'll think about this in terms of what Brenner and Walthall are doing with the book of Ruth. So when we look at non-traditional hermeneutics, right? So hermeneutics that read against the grain, against traditional interpretations of biblical texts, or any sort of ancient texts. We can think about liberation hermeneutics, which we've talked about, liberation theology, feminist hermeneutics or interpretation, postcolonial interpretation, LGBTQ plus interpretation, right? So they all fall into these 5 different categories or ways of reading. So the first is reading with a more romantic view, right? With a more romanticized idea of what the Bible is saying. And this is then a commitment to an idealized or idyllic view of the Bible. I want you to try to think of someone, of any author over the past semester that you can say this person absolutely idealized the Bible and saw it as an example or something to aspire to, right? Maybe even think in the last couple weeks. If you are thinking about Melanie Chitwood, you're right! This would be a romantic view of the text, right? This is something that you want to aspire toward, right? Rather than reading it critically, you see it as a guidebook. The second way is to read it resistantly, and this is with a commitment to a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? And this would be who? Who can you think of anyone who reads with a hermeneutic of suspicion? Well, if you said Athalia Brenner, you would be correct. In fact, she says she does a suspicious reading of Proverbs 31, even in the title of her essay. So what then is she suspicious of? She's suspicious of the fact that this text was written by men, right? So if you're a woman reading this text, you've got to think, wait a second, this wasn't written with me in mind or to necessarily benefit me. It was written with men in mind and for their benefit, right? So we can think about that anytime we're looking at the text, in any text, right? Thinking more critically rather than just accepting what it says at face value. The third is to read toward rupture. And this is trying to disrupt then those binary categories, which could be categories of sex, of gender, of race, or of class, right? Thinking about maybe ways to blur boundaries or not to think of things as so black or white either or. Who might that be? Well, if you're thinking about the Joseph reading, you'd be spot on, right? This is a way in which we're trying to think beyond someone being in an either or category. If we're looking at reclamation, then, which is number 4, it's a commitment to strategies of appropriation, thinking about how we might read for marginalized communities. A great example of this would be, in fact, the Walthall essay for today, right? She, as an LGBTQ plus person, is trying to reclaim the scripture. Another colleague of mine, Stephanie Day Powell, actually wrote her entire dissertation and published a book on talking and thinking about ways to reclaim the text of Ruth, right? Which has traditionally been read as a heterosexual love story. Is it possible to think about this text in other ways, specifically if this marriage covenant, these marriage vows, are actually spoken and it's between 2 women? The final way is toward re-engagement, and this is a commitment to making a difference. for people who otherwise have not seen themselves in these texts or have used these texts for their own liberation or empowerment. So who then, I want you to think about who's trying to re-engage these texts from their own specific context and identity, right? And this could be a number of readers, right? Even Aftandilian trying to do an Indigenous American reading of the text, right? Indigenous Americans haven't normally seen this as a sacred text. He's trying to find a way to connect those dots. So I want you guys to be thinking about that, especially as we look toward the exam at the end of the week, because I'm going to ask you a question specifically about this, right? Trying to get you to think about ways in which people throughout the semester have read these texts and where do they fall in these 5 categories. Okay, that's all.